Okay, thank you so much for joining us all here today for this webinar series for National Biochar Week. And thank you, Chuck and Tina, for allowing me to be part of these webinars, where I'm very excited to share some of our research and our practical uses of biochar in the field in relation to tree health and survival. My name is Emma Schaffert. I'm a research technician originally from the UK. I work for Bartlett Tree Research Laboratories. And now I'm currently based out of their lab in Charlotte, North Carolina. But the research that I'm going to be discussing with you today, that's been conducted over the past 6 years, has all been based in the UK. And I'll discuss the individual trial sites as we progress through the presentation. So let's begin by discussing how our research question came about. Trees in the urban environment are very important for human populations. They provide a wide range of benefits, everything from improvements in physical and mental well-being, all the way right through to increases in oxygen production and improvements in the environment and reduction of pollutants. And these trees tend to produce their maximum amount of benefits when they reach maturity. So we really want to promote the survival and longevity of trees in the urban environment. We want trees to reach their maximum potential. But unfortunately, the annual tree mortality of trees planted in the urban environment is quite high due to large losses after planting from transplant shock and then adverse environmental conditions that they experience in the urban environment. Some of these issues include compaction and poor soil structure, nutrient and moisture depletion, increases of flooding due to impervious surfaces, and then increased temperatures from the urban heat island effect, which could also adversely affect trees planted in that environment. So we were really looking for a way to reduce these stresses on the tree and improve survival and health of these trees. And to do that, we were interested in improving the soil quality for tree growth and survival, improving that soil profile and soil characteristics for root production and root health. And one of the things that we were interested in investigating was this product called biochar. And biochar is a very porous product. It's very charcoal-like. It's produced by heating biomass in a low oxygen environment through a process called pyrolysis. And it can be produced from any kind of biomass, anything from animal origin, animal waste, poultry litter, agricultural waste such as rice husk and corn stover, right the way through to wood chip and woody material biomass, which is what we'll mainly focus on in my discussions today. So what makes a successful biochar for use in soil? It depends on many different variables and factors. I'm only going to focus on a few of these in my talk today, but the main thing I'd really like to highlight to you all is that biochars are not created equal. There's a huge amount of variation between different types of biochars, depending on different characteristics of the feedstock material, so that biomass that we're producing the biochar from. The production methods, so whether it's fast or slow pyrolysis, whether it's made in a kiln or whether it's made in a barrel or different production types. The temperatures that the biochar is heated to is very key and important. Post-production handling, so whether that biochar is then exposed to water or any gases or any activation of any kind, or preloaded with any fertilizers or any nutrients. The biochar particle size can have a big effect on the outcome in the soil, the application amount, the application methods, which I'll go over slightly during my trial sections. The soil type where it's applied. So biochar can have very different effects on different soil types depending on what the desired function is. So for example, if you wanted to look at improving the moisture relations of a soil, biochar may be able to improve moisture retention more so in a sandy soil than it would do in a clay. So it's very much dependent on soil type. And then of course the function that is desired in the soil that you're applying to. So like I said, whether you're looking at improving the moisture relations or the nutrient retention and the cation exchange capacity, whether you're looking to reduce compaction and improve the soil profile, or all of these factors, this will vastly affect what kind of biochar you're interested in applying. And then also the change of function in soil over time. Many studies are concentrated on a short-term study, so over months or a year or two. And knowing the effect of biochar in soil over years and longer periods of time is not necessarily something that we have investigated very widely as a scientific community. So as I said, I'm going to focus on a few of these characteristics in my research. The main variables that we've looked at changing are the biomass that the biochar is produced from. So we've compared different types of biomasses, although they're all of plant origin. We've looked at different soil types where the biochar has been applied. We've looked at different functions reside in the soil, be it reducing compaction or improving moisture relations. And we've looked at the change of the function in the soil over time. So most of the trials that we have run have been at least 4 years in duration. And then one trial, which I'll briefly mention, was 2 years. So we've tried to look at slightly longer term trials, although ideally we'd be looking at a decade or more. And as I've said, we're looking at plant-based biochars. The particle size we ensured was 5 millimeters or less. We sieved each biochar type. The application rate was consistently 5% by volume. So we did it by volume because the weights of the biochars can vary so dramatically depending on what the biomass type was to produce them. And we looked at soil type. We looked at clay loams, we looked at potting mixes. I'll discuss those as we go over each trial. And then we measured plant vitality, plant growth, and root development and root growth. So I'll be discussing those different parameters throughout the different trials. And as I said, longer term trials to try and analyze the effects of biochar over time. Biochar is has a very long life in soil. The half-life of many biochars is 2,500 years. So it's very important to analyze what the effects could be over time and whether or not that could change for the detriment of the trees over time. So here are the 4 main feedstocks and biomasses that we've looked at in our research. We typically as a company apply biochar that's made from pine kill, so from pine beetle kill. The pine trees are then recycled and used through pyrolysis to make biochar. So that would be our softwood there. We've also looked at rice husk biochar. Namibian acacia is a type of Vachellia reficiens, I think is the species name. It's an invasive plant in many African countries. It's very invasive in the rangelands, so that's a potential use for that invasive species. It's already been cleared. It's a waste product, so we can pyrolyze it to produce biochar. And then also we've looked at hardwood biochar, which has in previous research had a very good response with the biochar in relation to tree growth and improvements in soil conditions. So I'm not going to go too much into these analyses that we did, other than just to emphasize that biochars are very variable, as I've said, and that it's really important to analyze and assess biochar for the appropriateness for the desired function that you would like in soil. So here we looked at how biochar affects the plant available water capacity in soil, how it affects bulk density, which relates to compaction, and then how the biochar affects the water repellency of the soil. So another factor that could affect moisture relations in that soil. And just quickly, the highlights from these findings were the softwood and the hardwood biochar significantly improved plant available water capacity when amended in soil. However, interestingly, looking at the water repellency results, the higher that value is, that surface tension, the lower the water repellency. So you can see that the softwood actually significantly increased the water repellency when it was amended into soil, which interestingly did not affect its effect on plant available water. It still improved that water availability. So water repellency of biochar when it is mixed in soil isn't necessarily an indicator of the plant available water capacity. And the Namibian acacia and rice husk biochars both significantly reduce the bulk density, which basically reduced compaction. So those are some highlights from the basic analyses that we did on the biochar. And the main trial that I want to discuss with you all today is based in a London borough in the UK. We planted street trees along several different residential roads in the UK in this particular borough. The area that we covered was 5 square miles. And you can see from the climate data, it was quite a warm environment compared to other surrounding environments because it was within an urban environment. And the rainfall was actually lower than another trial site where we measured in a more rural area. So it's 502 millimeters per year. And again, so you can see the different biochar products we applied. We have the 4 plant-based biochar products that I discussed earlier. And then we also had a commercially available product called Tree Growth Enhancer, or I think now it's called Soil Improver, which is manufactured and sold by Carbon Gold in the UK. And we included that for comparison to see how that would perform in the urban soil. And all the biochars were actually provided to us by Carbon Gold in the UK. And you can see from the images that the tree pit that the trees are planted into are very small. This is very typical for urban planted trees. And we tried to not alter the process by which the contractor was planting the trees at all. We merely just added the biochar at a 5% rate into the backfill when they were replacing the soil around the planted tree. And they put a watering bag on the tree, they staked the tree, they caged the tree for protection. Everything was maintained the same as would be in a normal planting process in this borough. And you can see this was 2019 data for the roots. The hardwood biochar, interestingly, significantly reduced the mean root mass per cubic centimeter of soil, which is basically a measure of the volume of that soil and relates to the bulk density. So it's very interesting how it significantly reduced the root mass, because we would think that biochar might promote root growth and promote root elongation to access the moisture and nutrients that it needs to uptake. But potentially the biochar is actually reducing the need for this root elongation and root growth, because it doesn't have to search out the resources that it requires and needs to uptake. So that was an interesting finding from that urban trial in 2019. The visual data for that year also actually had some interesting results. The hardwood biochar and the Namibian acacia, and also that tree growth enhancer, so that commercially available product, all significantly improved the visual condition ratings of those trees. And the visual condition ratings were determined from crown size, crown density, and the presence of epichlor mix. So it was a visual assessment of how healthy those trees were looking from a visual standpoint. And if you're interested in the method that we used, it was from a paper by Sepulveda et al. In 2018. So I can provide a reference for that if anyone's interested. But it was interesting how the hardwood biochar significantly reduced the root weight or the root mass of the samples taken, but it actually improved the visual condition of the trees. So not necessarily a negative impact on those roots there, where maybe resource allocation was put less into the roots and more into the shoot and the health of the crown, which is definitely a beneficial impact of that hardwood biochar. And the second trial I'm going to talk about today, or the second and third trials I'm going to talk about today, are based on a site near Reading, called a place called Shimfield. This is where the UK Bartlett Research Lab is based and where I worked for 6 years before moving to the US. As you can see, the rainfall here is a little heavier than in London, and the maximum summer temperature is the same, but the minimum winter temperature is a bit colder. It's actually 2 degrees centigrade colder in this Reading site than in London. And we did one potted pear trial where we looked at biochar. For this trial, we just looked at the hardwood biochar chip because it was such a successful biochar in different trials that we've looked at in the past. And we looked at preloading that biochar with fertilizer, and then applying fertilizer alone, and then drenching the fertilizer after the biochar application and tree planting to see whether those different methods had an effect on root growth and the soil conditions and the tree vitality. And you can see from the graph, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but it's just for interest if anyone wants to see the data. The yellow bars are the mean surface area of those roots per plant or per tree. And you can see that there were some significant differences in that data. And then the hatched bars were the mean root lengths of each individual treatment. And so I've summarized the findings from that graph on this next slide a bit more clearly. You can see that all of the treatments applied increased the surface area of the roots that were measured. And there were 2 treatments that significantly increased. So when we say significantly, we mean that it increased it significantly by 0.05 p-value when we statistically analyze that data. And so 2 treatments, the biochar pre-soaked with fertilizer and the fertilizer alone, significantly increased that root surface area per plant. And when we look at the root lengths, all treatments apart from that fertilizer treatment actually decreased the length, and 2 significantly so. So what we can tell from some of these results is that even though some of the root lengths were decreased, the surface area was actually improved with all of those treatments. So potentially, as I mentioned earlier, not so much resource allocation is being put into that root production in terms of length, but it could be improving the surface area of the roots without having to put on so much growth. So that was also an interesting finding from that potted trial. And the final trial I want to discuss with you today with some interesting findings that we've done was the field planted pear trial. So the same species of tree as that last potted trial. We looked at 2 different cultivars of pears, Conference and Doyon du Comice for this trial. We went back to the original 4 biochars, so the rice husk, the mixed softwood, the Namibian acacia, and the hardwood biochars. And we applied this again at 5% by volume at the time of planting to see whether or not the biochars would help improve survival after planting and then the subsequent health and growth of those trees. And we found some interesting results again with the root mass. We found that there was a significant effect during 2018 on the root mass in both of the cultivars. So the top chart there of the graph is showing the Conference cultivar, and the bottom chart is showing the Doyen du Comice cultivar. And you can see that for both the cultivars, there's significant effects in 2018 on the root mass, but there was very little effect in 2019. There was no effect on the Doyen du Comice cultivar, but there was some slight significant effect on the Conference. But just to focus on 2018, the root mass was significantly decreased by several of the treatments. Again, something that we didn't originally expect to find in our data, but it was interesting to see that this is a continual trend through some of our trials, albeit through different soil types and through different tree species. So interesting findings there. And again, the hardwoods, the Namibian acacia, and the softwood this time were the best performers in terms of reducing root mass on those trees. And I should say that with all of these research trials, we did measure root mass. We measured above ground growth, so shoot, stem extension, diameter of the trunk, and the heights, crown spread, various different growth parameters. And none of those were significantly affected across the trials. It was just the root growth that was reduced, or the root mass, sorry, that was reduced. So just to summarize what we found throughout our trials and what we try to use in the company throughout the country for our recommendations. So biochar has shown that it does have potential to reduce demand on that root system and to improve the root surface area without necessarily having to elongate the roots and produce root length, and could there allow more resource allocation to the crown area and to above ground growth and vitality. But I should emphasize that our trials were, as I mentioned earlier, a specific soil type. We investigated clay loam soil types and those urban soils, which were predominantly tarmac in a lot of cases, but were quite clay based also. And soil type is very important. So we've examined biochar in these soil types, but it's very important to look into what your desired function is in your desired soil type. And the premium biochar product that we mentioned earlier, so the commercially available biochar in the UK, is around about £3 per litre, which translates to around about $4 at the moment with a conversion rate. And at an application rate of 5% by volume, you're looking around about 7 to 10 litres for a small tree planting when you amend that planting pit at the time of planting. So if you're amending existing mature trees with either air spading, which is like an air tillage process, or digging in that biochar, or trenching, or vertical mulching with the biochar, that can be up to 20 litres, and above that you're applying to that area around the tree. We typically want to apply the biochar to the drip line, which is where the crown reaches to diameter-wise or more, but ideally to that drip line is what we aim for when we're applying to trees in our business. So it can be quite an expensive application, but it does appear to be worth it over a longer term period for tree survival and improvements in tree vitality. And mulching on the surface of the soil can also help to improve the effects of biochar, we found through our investigations, and reduce the erosion of that biochar from the soil surface. So thank you ever so much for listening today. It's been really wonderful to contribute to this webinar. And if anyone has any questions, I will be participating in the Q&A session today. And here is my email address also if you had any questions about any of the trials that we've conducted. So thank you very much for listening.